She planted the first seeds on a Tuesday morning in late April, and by Thursday, the entire settlement of Granger Flats had an opinion about it. Not about the planting itself. Gardens were expected. Gardens were sensible. A woman alone with 2 children on a homestead claim in the Nebraska sandhills needed a garden the way she needed a roof, and nobody would have said a word about beans or turnips or even a modest row of sweet corn along the south fence. What stopped people was where Nora Vass was planting. Not in the garden plot her husband had broken and bordered with flat stones before he died. Not in the rich, dark soil near the well where the ground held moisture longest. She was planting against the cabin walls, all 4 of them, pressing seeds into the narrow strip of earth between the foundation logs and the packed dirt yard, working her way around the structure with the methodical patience of someone following a plan that existed entirely in her own mind and had not been shared with anyone. Her daughter Lisbeth, who was 11 and had her father's quality of quiet attention, carried the seed sack and passed it forward whenever her mother's hand came back for it. Her younger boy, Martin, who was 7 and had recently decided that every task benefited from his commentary, asked approximately every 4 minutes whether they were done yet. He was not given a satisfying answer. Nora Vass was 34 years old. She had been widowed 8 months since the previous August, when Eric Vass had gone out to check on the livestock during a fast-moving storm and had not come back. They found him 2 days later when the weather cleared, half a mile from the barn, which told you everything about how that storm had moved, and nothing useful about how to live without him. She had spent the winter that followed in the specific, grinding way of a woman who has no time to stop, because stopping would mean thinking about everything she was not allowed to stop and think about. She had kept the fire, kept the animals, kept the children fed, kept the claim. Now it was spring, and she was planting sunflowers against her cabin walls, and the settlement had questions. The man with the loudest questions was Absalom Greer, who ran cattle on the section east of her claim, and who had the particular confidence of someone who has been right about enough things in his life that he has stopped tracking which things those were. He rode past on the second day of planting and pulled up his horse and looked at what she was doing with the expression of a man watching someone make a mistake he feels personally inconvenienced by. "Sunflowers," he said. Nora pressed a seed into the soil and moved 6 inches along the wall. Against the cabin, she moved another 6 inches. Absalom shifted in the saddle. "You know what sunflowers do to foundation logs? They hold water. Water holds rot. You'll have a soft wall by next summer." Nora sat back on her heels and looked at him with the level, unhurried expression she had developed over a winter of solving problems that had no good solutions. "Thank you, Absalom." He waited for more. There was no more. He clicked his horse forward and rode on, and behind him Nora returned to the seeds, and Lisbeth moved the sack forward, and Martin asked again whether they were done yet. The idea had not come from Nebraska. It had come from Eric's grandmother, a woman who had spent her first 30 years in a settlement in the Prussian countryside before her family joined a group of emigrating Mennonites and crossed the ocean to start again in Pennsylvania. She was already old when Nora knew her, a woman of enormous practical knowledge, delivered in a voice so quiet you had to lean toward it. She had talked about the sunflowers one evening, while Nora was newly married and sitting with her at the kitchen table, and she had not talked about them as though she were passing along wisdom. She talked about them the way she talked about everything useful, as plain fact, the way you might describe how to salt a ham or read a weather sky. In the old country, she said, the farmhouses wrapped themselves in sunflowers before winter, not the short, ornamental kind, the tall ones, grown close to the wall, left to dry where they stood, their stalks becoming a second skin around the house. The dead plants held air. Still air, trapped in all those hollow stems and spaces, was what stood between a family and the cold. She said it once and moved on to something else, and Nora had filed it in the place where you file things you are not ready to use yet. She was ready now. What she did not explain to Absalom Greer or to anyone else who stopped at the fence line to voice their assessment was that she had spent the previous winter in a cabin whose north wall sweated frost on the inside during the hard cold of January. She had lain awake in the deep hours of February mornings, listening to the wind find every gap in the chinking and work at it with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. She had burned through her fuel faster than she had planned and had spent the last 3 weeks of winter rationing in ways that required choices she did not want to make again. She had decided somewhere in those cold, quiet hours that she was not going to arrive at another winter in the same condition. The sunflowers were not a decoration, they were a response. By June, the plants were knee-high, and the settlement's interest had sharpened from curiosity to active skepticism. A woman named Nora Vass, whose husband ran the grain supply operation in Granger Flats, told someone at the dry goods store that Nora Vass had gone a little strange since Eric died, which was a comfortable explanation that required no further investigation. The minister's wife suggested kindly that perhaps the grief had expressed itself in an unusual direction, which was the same explanation wearing a more sympathetic coat. The carpenter who had built 3/4 of the cabins in Granger Flats was a man named Pelle Sorensen. He was Danish, methodical, and not unkind, but he had opinions about wood that he held with the conviction of a man who has watched enough structures fail to feel entitled to them. He stopped at the Vass place on a morning in late June when the sunflowers were waist-high and beginning to lean toward the sun with the slow, committed turning that gives the plant its name. He stood at the property line and looked at the walls for a long time before speaking. "The stalks will trap moisture against the logs," he said. It was almost exactly what Absalom Greer had said, which suggested that the settlement had arrived at a consensus. Nora was working a loose board on the lean-to roof. She did not come down. "Damp logs crack in the cold," Pelle continued. "Cracked logs invite more damp. By the time you see the damage, it's already deep." He paused. "I've replaced walls for this reason, more than once." "I know you have," Nora said from the roof. "You did good work on the Henriksen place." Pelle accepted this. "The Henriksen place didn't have sunflowers against the foundation." "No," Nora said, "it didn't." She went back to the board. Pelle stood at the fence line a moment longer, the way people do when they feel a conversation should have ended differently. Then he rode back toward town. What neither he nor Absalom nor Nora Vass nor the minister's wife could see, because it was not visible from the outside and Nora had not described it, was what she intended to do with the sunflowers after the growing season ended. The plants themselves were only the first part. The stalks, dried and dense and hollow, stacked and tied against the walls as the cold came on, were the second. Eric's grandmother had been specific about this. You grew them close so that when they dried, you had them exactly where you needed them, already in position, already oriented to the walls, the labor of placement largely done by the summer itself. It was a system. It required patience, and it required a willingness to look foolish for several months before the outcome was available to anyone's inspection. Nora had patience. She had demonstrated considerable tolerance for looking foolish in the eyes of Granger Flats over the past 8 months, and had not collapsed under the weight of it. August brought a wind event that knocked the western row flat. 3 days of hard gusts off the high plains, the kind that came down from the northwest with nothing to slow them for 200 miles. And when it was done, 1/3 of the plants along that wall were broken at the stem or pulled loose from the soil entirely. Absalom Greer saw it from his fence line and said nothing, which, in its own way, said everything. Nora was outside the following morning before the light was full. She worked along the row for the better part of 2 days, straightening what could be straightened, replacing what could not, driving new stakes and stringing cord between them so that the remaining stalks could distribute the load of the next wind rather than each one standing alone against it. Lisbeth worked beside her without being asked. Martin moved stakes to where his mother pointed and considered this a significant contribution, which it was. By the end of the week, the western row stood again. It was not identical to what had been there before. The cord between the stakes gave it a different structure, a connected one, And when the next wind came through in late August, the row moved as a unit rather than plant by plant, and not one stalk went down. Pell Sorensen rode past and noticed. He did not stop, but he looked at the cord and the stakes for a longer moment than a man looks at something he has already dismissed. September came in cool, and the sunflowers reached their full height, some of them pushing past 6 feet along the south wall where the light was best. The seed heads were heavy, and the plants had taken on the slightly exhausted look of things that have done what they were built to do and are now settling into the work of finishing. Nora harvested seed from a portion of them and stored it in cloth sacks. The rest she left where they stood. The dying was the point. As October moved through its short, darkening days, the stalks stiffened and dried. The leaves lost their green and curled inward. The stems, already woody from a full summer's growth, became harder and more hollow, which was exactly what hollow meant in terms of what they would do against winter air. Nora began the binding work in the second week of October, tying bundles of dried stalks together with cord and pressing them close against the logs, filling gaps with smaller material, weaving the broad, dried seed heads into spaces the way you fit irregular stones into a wall. Lisbeth helped with the binding. Martin helped by narrating the process in considerable detail to anyone who would listen, which at the moment was primarily the dog. By the end of October, the cabin had begun to disappear. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the walls were becoming something other than walls. They were becoming layered, wrapped, packed with the summer's own material, and the structure that emerged looked unlike anything else in Granger Flats. It looked, Dora Haas said at the dry goods store, like something between a cabin and a haystack. And the laughter that followed was genuine and relaxed, the laughter of people who have decided the question is settled. Nora heard about the haystack remark the same afternoon. She was tightening a cord on the north wall when Lisbeth told her, having heard it from a boy at the school who had heard it from his mother. Nora finished tightening the cord before she said anything. "Is the binding holding on that corner?" Lisbeth checked. "Yes." "Good." Nora moved to the next section. Outside, November was 2 weeks away. The high country to the northwest had gone white. The mornings smelled like iron. The grass had the particular brittleness of vegetation that has given up arguing with the season. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the winter that would answer every question Granger Flats had been asking since April was gathering itself and considering when to arrive. The cabin stood wrapped and ready in the cold autumn light, looking nothing like a conventional homestead and exactly like what it was. A preparation. An argument made not in words, but in dried stems and cord and still trapped air, waiting for the weather to deliver its verdict. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The cold arrived the way serious cold always arrives in the Nebraska sandhills, without announcement. Nora woke on the morning of December 3rd to a stillness that was its own kind of warning. No wind, no sound from the animals. The dog, a thick-coated brown animal named Bram that Eric had brought back from a trading trip 3 years ago, was pressed against the base of the cabin door with his nose tucked under his tail, which was not where he slept when the night was ordinary. She lay still for a moment, reading the quality of the silence. Then she rose and fed the stove before she did anything else. The thermometer outside the door read 19 below before the sun had cleared the eastern flats. She brought in 2 extra armloads of wood and stacked them near the stove. She checked the children, both still asleep under their quilts, faces slack and warm. She put water on for porridge and stood at the window and looked at the north wall of the cabin from the inside, at the logs she had chinked and re-chinked. And then she thought about what was on the other side of those logs. The dried stalks, the bound bundles, the trapped air in 1,000 hollow stems. She had done the work. Now the work would answer for itself. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped another 8 degrees. The sky had gone the color of old pewter, flat and textureless, the kind of sky that is not building toward weather, but has already become it. Nora kept the stove at a steady pace, not roaring, not racing through fuel, just the long, even burn that the cast iron preferred when it was asked to work for hours rather than minutes. The thermometer inside the cabin held at 58 degrees. She recorded it in the small ledger she had kept since October. Date, time, interior temperature, wood consumed. Simple figures, the kind of record that meant nothing to anyone who had not spent a winter learning to read what numbers said about preparation. The blizzard came that night. It came from the northwest in the way of the worst ones, not building gradually, but arriving nearly at full strength within the first hour, the wind going from nothing to something that pressed against the walls with a continuous physical force, not gusting, not relenting, just pushing with the steady mechanical patience of weather that has decided on a direction and is not interested in negotiating. Snow drove horizontally. The sound against the cabin was not the soft accumulation of an ordinary storm. It was a hiss, sharp and constant, like sand thrown against glass. Nora sat by the stove and listened to it, and fed the fire at intervals, and did not feel afraid, which was its own information. She had felt afraid the previous winter. She remembered it specifically, the particular quality of lying awake, listening to wind find the gaps in the chinking, the cold creeping across the floor toward the children's corner. The calculations she ran in the dark about how much wood remained and how many days of winter did too. Fear had a texture she recognized. What she felt tonight was different. She felt the storm outside and she felt the warmth inside, and between those two things was the wall she had built from a summer's worth of work. And she trusted it. At 2 in the morning, she checked the thermometer. 54 degrees. The temperature had dropped 4 degrees in 6 hours, while the worst blizzard in 3 years drove itself against the outside of the cabin with everything it had. She put 2 pieces of ash on the fire, adjusted the damper, and went back to bed. The morning of the second day brought Absalom Greer to her door. He had not come to mock. The time for that had passed sometime during the night, when his own thermometer had dropped to 38 degrees, despite a stove he had burned hard and fast through fuel he could not afford to keep spending. He had 2 hired men helping him manage the cattle, and all 3 of them had spent the night in their coats. His chinking, which he had not re-examined since he had the cabin built 6 years ago, had been found out by the wind in approximately the way Nora's sunflower wall had been designed to prevent. He stood in her doorway with ice in his beard and looked at the room. Lisbeth was at the table with a book. Martin was eating porridge. The dog was asleep near the stove on a folded blanket, deeply unconcerned about the world outside. Absalom looked at the thermometer on the wall. He looked at it for a long moment. 56, he said. It was 54 at 2 this morning, Nora said. It's come up a little since sunrise. He was quiet, computing something. Mine was 38 at 2 this morning, with the stove running full. Nora poured him a cup of coffee and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The numbers said it with a precision that words would only have cluttered. Pell Sorensen came by that afternoon, ostensibly to check whether the storm had damaged the sunflower wall. He walked its perimeter in the driving cold, examining the bindings, pressing his palm against the outer layer, studying the places where the blizzard had stripped some of the outermost material away. He was there for 20 minutes. When he came inside and warmed his hands at the stove, he had the look of a carpenter examining joinery he had not expected to hold. The outer layer took the damage, he said finally. The inner layer is intact. Yes, Nora said. The outer layer was meant to. She looked at him. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. How thick did you build it? She told him. He asked about the cord spacing and the way she had oriented the stalks relative to the wall, and whether she had left a gap between the inner layer and the logs. She answered each question directly. He listened with the specific attention of a man converting what he is hearing into future practice. He did not say she had been right and he had been wrong. He did not need to. He was asking questions about method, which meant he intended to use it, which was the more useful form of acknowledgement anyway. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The wind dropped inside an hour, and the silence that followed had the slightly stunned quality of things that have been subjected to great force and are now taking stock. Snow stood 4 feet deep along the north wall of Nora's cabin. The outer surface of the sunflower layer was battered, stripped in places, frozen in others, but the dense inner wrapping against the logs was essentially intact. What had been sacrificed had been the part designed to be sacrificed, the outermost material absorbing the storm's force, so that everything behind it did not have to. Nora stood outside in the new quiet and looked at the wall. Then she looked at the wood stacked inside the lean-to. She had burned perhaps 60% of what she had expected to need for a 3-day storm of this severity. The rest would carry her well into February. She went inside and recorded the final entry for the storm in her ledger. Interior temperature at storm's end, 57 degrees. Wood consumed over 72 hours, noted. She closed the book and set it on the table. The following spring, Absalom Greer planted sunflowers against his cabin walls. He did it without ceremony, without explanation, without reference to any previous conversation. He simply did it, and if anyone in Granger Flats connected it to the winter that had just passed, they made that connection quietly and kept it to themselves. Pell Sorensen spent part of that spring developing what he called a proper installation method, incorporating the principles Nora had used into something he could recommend to clients. He never described it as something he had learned from her exactly, but the knowledge had an origin, and the origin was not mysterious to anyone paying attention. Nora Vass stopped mentioning the haystack. The subject lost its humor when the humor required ignoring what had happened in December, and ignoring that had become more work than it was worth. Nora Vass stayed on the claim. The following summer, Lisbeth was old enough to do the binding work largely on her own, and she did it with a care that suggested she had understood for some time that this was worth doing carefully. Martin, who was 8 now and had developed a somewhat more considered approach to commentary, told a boy at school that the flowers were for the cold, not for looking at. Which was exactly right. What Nora had carried from an old woman's quiet conversation at a kitchen table had turned out to be what it had always been, not folklore, not decoration, not the strange project of a widow who had gone a little sideways with grief. A system. One that had been tested by a December that tested everything in Granger Flats and had come through it doing exactly what it was designed to do. The winter had asked the question. The cabin had answered it. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments tonight, and tell us about something old you trusted when everyone around you said not to. We read every single one.